Okay, well, maybe the title is a slight exaggeration. The only wrong way you can play a game is a way in which you don't have fun. However, I often see people making the same mistakes when trying out Awakening's Lunatic mode. It has gained a bit of a reputation since its release, usually being criticised as a highly punishing, extremely hard mode that only the most broken strategies can conquer. However, I believe that this reputation is kind of undeserved. Don't worry, this isn't going to be one of those videos where I pretend that everything is actually super easy, but I think that a lot of the challenge that people face from this game is actually self-inflicted. I'm going to cover 3 basic mistakes that I see a lot of people make that are pretty simple to fix and will hopefully improve your overall experience with the difficulty mode. Mistake 1 is being too afraid of Lunatic's difficulty. I'm assuming that most people who are watching this have attempted Lunatic mode at some point, and have had a similar experience to me when they tried the same thing they did at the start of hard mode and instantly died on turn 1 or turn 2. The enemies are much stronger than on hard, and the fact that you game over so quickly can make the mode feel like there is nothing you can do to win, and if you check online, you'll find that a lot of people will agree with you. Let's just type Fire Emblem Awakening Lunatic mode into Google and see what we get. And if you're wondering why I'm using incognito mode, it's so that Google doesn't try and tailor searches to me. We get a guide from IGN and videos on surviving the first chapter and countless Reddit threads and forum posts complaining about the fearsome difficulty of this mode. It's understandable why someone who's new to Lunatic might start to have doubts about how beatable the mode is, which is likely to make them play worse. If all people hear is that a map requires insane RNG to beat, then they won't try and improve the strategy and instead are more likely to try and brute force the RNG with the same strategy over and over, hoping for a different result. This also leads to situations where players are more likely to play very defensively, trying to avoid death for as long as possible while turtling up. This actually ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, where turtling through maps can often make them much harder than they need to be. By constantly running from the enemies, the player wastes their player phase actions they could have used to kill threatening enemies. Although the player may end up living to turn 4 or 5, they now have to fight off 2 or 3 turns worth of enemies all at once, which their army couldn't possibly handle, making the game feel truly impossible. As I said before, my aim isn't to present this mode as easy, but I want people to realise that this mode isn't nearly as scary as it has been made out to be. In truth, it's not really much worse than, say, FE6 hard mode. Another one of my biggest problems with people overestimating the game's difficulty is it means that anyone who has beaten the game is likely to just assume that the strategy they used is good, because, well, it beat Lunatic mode, right? So it has to be good. This is how you end up with people making all sorts of odd recommendations online, and why some people seem to insist that the only way to beat it is to do their specific strategy with their specific set of skills on a specific set of characters. This also in turn makes the game seem harder than it is, hyping up its difficulty to anyone who hasn't played it, which amplifies this effect further, basically creating an infinite loop that ends with players seeing any character that beats Lunatic mode as an instant S tier and everyone else as unusable garbage. A specific example of this would be the current way a lot of people view Sumia. She's a perfectly okay unit that's decent at some things, but she constantly gets recommended for Lunatic mode, even though there are many significantly better candidates to train in that mode. When people get through Lunatic mode with their Sumia, they mention to everyone else that they beat Lunatic mode with Sumia, therefore Sumia must be good. This looping logic has given her a reputation as an incredibly good unit when anyone looking at what she actually achieves in most games will see she's average at best. While I agree that players should play with what they find fun, first and foremost, it annoys me when people take that opinion and then try to use it as a reason for why their specific character setup is the best way to beat Lunatic, because chances are it probably isn't. Not only can you beat this with just about any unit, you can beat it without any weird AI manipulation tricks, you can beat it without doing any one-turn clears, you can beat it without Robin, and recently this game was beaten 0% growths by Topaz, and as I'm recording this it seems that Rengar is working on 0% Lunatic Plus. You don't need an encyclopedic knowledge of this game to do well, you just need to stay calm and be prepared to reset some maps a couple of times, and sometimes a lot more than a couple of times until you develop a good strategy for them. Chances are, if someone says that something is impossible, or unbeatable, or that this is the only way you can clear this, then they don't really know what they're talking about. Let's revisit the prologue for a second and take a look at what we're facing down. These enemies might look punishingly strong at first, but every non-barbarian enemy can be straight up one-shot by Frederick's Silver Lance, and any barbarian he fights will be left low enough for Robin or Chrom to finish them off. Here, I'm moving Frederick into a position where he can deal with 4 of the starting enemies over the course of turn 1, instantly killing the 2 Myrmidons and weakening the barbarians. I make a note of the fact that I can't attack the mage without drawing aggro from the bridge, so I get Robin and Chrom to finish off the barbarians while Frederick moves to a better position. On the next turn, I can either kill the mage with a combination of Robin and Chrom, or just ochre them with Frederick. And that's the entire bottom part done without much risk involved. The purpose of this isn't to say, look noobs, you are terrible at Fire Emblem and can't beat this easy mode, but to demonstrate that you don't need some incredible 500 IQ RNG reliant strategy to win. You just need to not panic, think through your moves, and use Frederick where you need him. And if you think that I could only do this because there's a perfect series of moves and it's the only way of beating the chapter, then you're wrong. You could just as easily move Frederick to the bottom part of the map like this, so he can weaken either 1 or 2 barbarians depending on enemy movement, kill a Myrmidon and be in position to kill the mage on the next turn. From here, Robin and Chrom can just clean up the scraps to get XP. We can then have Frederick weaken this barbarian here so that Robin and Chrom can finish him off as well. Heck, I can even just move Frederick north on turn 1 and attack the barbarian like this. Then I just need to keep everyone outside of the mage's range while Robin cleans up a barbarian. Frederick and Robin can then kill the remaining 2 enemies on player phase. Hopefully this has demonstrated that you don't need a laser-specific or RNG-reliant strategy to make Awakening's Lunatic mode. We make sure to be as aggressive as possible without getting ourselves killed. I know a lot of people don't like having their units as close to death in my examples, but I would argue that you aren't really making full use of a unit if you never let their HP drop below, say, a third HP. Obviously you shouldn't just let your units die or make them take damage for no reason, but if there are no other threats around, it doesn't really matter if Crom is at 2 HP on the end of his turn. While we're here, we may as well cover the other part of the prologue that terrifies people, which is the water trick. I'm sure a lot of you know what this trick is, but for those who don't, you can have Robin and Crom walk into the moat and manipulate the AIs so that Robin can shoot them with thunder without getting retaliated against ever. I want to pose a question to everyone watching. What do you think the purpose of this trick is? I'm sure the most common answer is something like, well, it's the only way of beating the enemies, or the enemies are too strong to take on one-on-one. This isn't actually true in Lunatic, nor is it true in Lunatic Plus, although it's often advised you do it in that mode. No, the reason that this trick is done in some runs is that it gives Robin a bit more XP and weapon rank, because you get more hits and kill a higher percentage of the enemies on the map. You can actually just kill the enemies on the bridge with relative ease, providing you don't just go in all guns blazing, and Robin still receives a really good chunk of XP from it. Now obviously, most people would still rather have the extra XP on Robin, but the idea that this trick is mandatory and its overprevalence in guides often leads to players giving up in the prologue, as it can be hard to replicate if you just don't know the quite right moves for it. Mistake 2 is incorrect or unoptimal use of pair-up. Not utilising pair-up to its funnest potential makes the game much harder than it needs to be, and using it properly is actually often just more a case of making some small changes to your playstyle. If you watch anyone play the game, you'll probably see them do the same thing on turn 1. They automatically pair their units together until all their units are paired or they have an odd number of units. I'm going to be blunt and say that this is a terrible strategy. I think a lot of people don't realise this because of how the game presents things, but pairing up all your units in your army on turn 1 actually removes half the possible moves you can make with your army. If you have an army of 14 units and pair them all together, you've gone from having 14 moves on player phase to having 7. Now, there are definitely some situations where just autopilot pairing units is optimal, such as later into the game where your units are stronger than the enemies and want to juggernaut through chapters, but in the early stages of the game, it might be wise to first work out exactly where you are going to want to pair up for extra stats on one unit versus having the option to have 2 player phase actions. As you can see in the footage I'm showing, immediately pairing up without thinking can cost your units their life because you can't kill the enemies fast enough. While it might be true that giving Sully plus 4 strength with Vake gives her a powerful 17 attack, you'll always do more damage by having Vake and Sully attack targets individually, making them face 16 attack from Vake and 13 from Sully. This is vital in very early maps of the game where you have waves of enemies coming at you that you have to kill. Generally, instead of just blindly pairing up, you should ask, what does this pair-up provide to me in this moment? Maybe the pair-up lets a unit double, or hit a kill threshold, or survive an extra hit, or avoid being doubled, and if that's the case, then you should go for it. In the clip now playing, you can see that sometimes choosing not to pair up can be a good move on player phase. I'm even able to miss with Crom and still make it through enemy phase with everyone unscathed. This also applies to what units you should be pairing with. A lot of people will say something like, I want Crom and Sully to S support, therefore I'm going to have them pair up for every turn past turn 2 of chapter 1, and they are never ever going to de-pair or pair with anyone else. Sure, you might want to build the support and it's worth doing at some point, but you may find that on a certain turn that another unit could really benefit from Crom's speed boost, or that someone else really wants Sully's pair up to be able to reach the front lines or survive an extra hit. You don't have to stick with the same person forever. It's also a good idea to build supports with these temporary partners, as C and A each give the pair up more total stats. Even if you don't plan on keeping the pair paired forever, or you could even be planning on benching one of them at some point, it's still worth your while to increase their stats at the current moment. When I play, I usually like to pair Vake and Lissa together because I like their support, and also because Falcon Knight Lissa gives Vake everything he needs to help carry the game. However, at the current moment, Lissa is just a sage, and I still have Pan in my army, who gives lots of strength, skill, and speed on pair up, which is exactly what Vake's needs to be successful. Even though I'm going to pair Vake and Lissa to S support anyway later, I may as well deploy Pan and build some support with Vake now, so he can be more effective at taking out the enemies. Another way I see people shooting themselves in the foot with pair-up is by pairing up strong units into weakened units in the hopes that it will make the weaker unit good. A common example is trying to pair Frederick into someone like Donald, the idea being that poor combat stats can be made up for the strong pair-up and the weaker unit will eventually become stronger than the strong unit anyway. This is flawed on many levels. Frederick is an incredibly powerful unit in your army and is even stronger than Robin for a decent number of chapters. He has the ability to one-hit KO or massively damage just about any enemy with a Silver Lance, tank a bunch of enemy hits, soften a bunch of enemies, and he'll stay doubling fairly consistently for a while with a good speed pair-up, such as Crom, Sumia, Pan, or Cordelia. Deleting him from your army to make a weak unit slightly less weak is not going to help your army. It's going to immediately reduce the power of your army for a very, very slight increase to the stats of a unit that's going to take forever to even match his stats. And very often, the weak units that want this buff don't actually scale any better than the other characters. The characters of the best late games tend to have some form of NFA ceiling combined with high stats. Robin, Vic, Chrom, Tharya, and Gregor all have a much better mid-late game than others in the cast, yet none of them have a particularly weak early game. They all do want to pair up at base, but they aren't going to remove the strongest unit in the map from the game. A simple speed pair up will actually be enough for most of these guys to contribute a good amount to any team willing to take them. This means you can keep good units like Frederick in the front lines. One other important use of pair up is that it can be used to negate enemy crit chances. In the first chapter, enemies can spawn with a random skill from their class, and one thing that tends to get people killed early is barbarians spawning with gamble and fighters spawning with zeal. A lot of people assume that you just have to hope you get lucky and avoid being crit, however that isn't always true. Supports work slightly differently in Awakening than in other games, but the one thing that is most similar to the other games is the dual support bonuses. These are the numbers that flash up on your unit when you enter combat if you have animations on. Every unit gains dual support points for every unit that is either adjacent or paired up with them, with higher support ranks giving more points. 3 points is all it takes for a unit to receive a free 10 crit avoid. That means that without any support, having 3 adjacent units or 2 adjacent units of 1 unit paired up with you is enough to entirely negate a crit chance, given by skills like Gamble and Zeal. Since you have 4 units in the prologue, it means that against key enemies you can negate crit chances by having everyone bunch up together. Now, you won't be able to negate every crit chance like this, as sometimes you can't afford to keep all units together like this, but it makes things a lot more manageable when the possibility arises. This also gets easier once you start stacking more supports. C supports will grant 2 points, so only 1 more adjacent unit will be required to negate crit chance, and a B grants 3, so once you reach B support you can entirely negate crit from Gamble and Wrath without any extra help. The final part of Power Up is all the different ways you can use it for movement. A lot of people just see it as a slightly upgraded rescue, but there are so many ways of using units around that can cover massive amounts of ground. 2 units that are moving somewhere can get an extra tile of move every turn just by pairing up at the start of their movement and separating at the end. You can transfer 1 unit between multiple units several times in a turn if you want to abuse a good pair of a lot of player phase attacks. Low move units can pair it to high move units, move and switch to negate their poor move stat. And staff users can do the same thing to turn every flyer in your army into a Falcon Knight, which can lead to insane one-turn strategies using rescue. Hell, you can actually have 2 units pair up, one of them transfer to another unit, and the original unit can still pair up. You can even just extend the movement stat of a good unit by pairing up into someone who is further away, like I did in one of my examples with the Frederick in the prologue. The possible movement options for this are endless, and you can do much more than simply pairing up 2 units that you want to have an S support with each other. Mistake 3 is not using all of your available resources. Whatever you might think about Awakening's gameplay, you have to give credit to the devs for the sheer amount of stuff you have access to. Part of the reason hard mode is so popular is that it makes this game a massive sandbox, where you can try countless different things and mess around with everything you are given. I know some things are basically considered cheating, such as recruiting spot pack units or bonus box characters, but there are still many other things that players have access to that can very easily increase the strength of their army for little or no cost. Tonics become available throughout the game, the first 2 showing up in the Chapter 3 shop, which sells strength and defense tonics for 150 gold. I know a lot of people are a bit hesitant on using them because they aren't permanent and they have a fear of using a consumable that they didn't need to, but the low price of tonics means that you can still be fairly liberal with how you hand them out between your army. Obviously you can't just whack strength tonics into every single member of your army for every single map of the game, but you can easily get away with giving 2 to 3 units strength plus 2 and defense plus 2 for all or most of the early game maps. Then you can hand out others as they are needed. It might sound like a large investment, but even giving someone 10 maps of strength plus 2 only costs 1500 gold. You basically give them an energy drop for the third of the game for the price of only 2 hand axes. The Chapter 6 store sells magic and resistance tonics. Magic is obviously useful for increasing the attack power of any magical combat units, but a magic tonic will also give +1 range to any ranged staff such as rescue or physics, just the +2 magic boost. Resistance is slightly less useful, but I'd still recommend taking it on units when going into maps where you'll know there will be a decent number of mages, such as Chapters 8 and 11, and most of the mid-Valmark to late game if you could spare the gold. Chapter 8 sells skill, speed, and luck. Speed is obviously the best tier, and the ability to give everyone in your army a constant +2 speed is unbelievably powerful and is worth far more than 150 gold. This should be on basically all of your combat units all of the time. Skill and luck are much less useful than other tonics, but I'd recommend keeping a couple around so you can put them on key units when you're facing down a map you've tried multiple times before and got stuck. A slight extra boost to your combat might just help you edge through. Chapter 16 sells the final tonic, HP. Again, there's basically no reason not to run it on your combat units. So just as an overall TLDW, I'd recommend running Strength or Magic, Defense, Speed, and HP when it's available on your main Juggernaut units that you want to carry the run. Magic on your staff users if you want to do a 1-turn, and everything else on as many people as possible when you're in a map where you're just really struggling and your tiny increase to stats might just give you the edge you need to go into viability. I was going to put forges on this list, but I do feel like people forge stuff at some point in a run. The only thing I would say is that it's generally best to forge weapons for killing bosses. Forging 1-2 range weapons is just going to have them immediately break and you'll have wasted your gold. There are a couple of exceptions, such as forging different wind tomes to kill wyverns in the early maps, but as a general rule, it's best to forge a weapon you plan to pull out every so often rather than when you need to. And yes, I'm aware that hoarding is a pitfall, but so is randomly smashing all of your weapons on generic bandits just for the sake of overkilling them. The most powerful resource on this list is the Rescue Staff. I mentioned it a couple of times in passing, but it's a staff you can buy once you've completed Chapter 12, or obtain from a chest in Prologue 1 or a village in Chapter 8. It has a range of magic divided by 2 and will teleport any unit you target within range to the staff user's position. You can use this to pull units out of danger, famously used on Rickon and Marable on turn 1 of Chapter 5. Pull your units closer to an enemy near you to kill, or even rescue green units to more favourable positions. You can have rescue users rescue other rescue users, do super long rescues, and then have other people pair up with flyers to increase their move. Throw dancing into the mix and you can skip a huge number of chapters. You can even just spam it every turn for XP as it gives quite a lot of it. Rescue is very low investment, being a relatively cheap staff that requires only E staves to use, and given that the army is bound to have multiple staff bots, you can massively increase their mobility just by having your staff bots carry a rescue around. Another resource is your pre promotes. Now, people are definitely a lot better at using them than they have been in the past, but the amount of people I've seen pair up Roblin Crow on turn 1 of the prologue and walk into one brigand is insane. You have Frederick. He can soften up every weaker enemy and one-shot every strong enemy. He can carry you through every map in the early game. Yes, I know there are hammers that you can dodge them fairly reliably with a equipped bronze sword. Use him. Outside of his strong early and mid-game performance, Frederick can also contribute as a utility unit in the late game. Once he reaches level 10, he can reclass into either Wyvern Lord or Griffin Rider, granting the player an extra 8-move flyer. Moving on from Fred, you've got Libra and Anna, who are not only strong staff bots, but have reasonable combat at base. Even if you don't care about one turns at all, their massive magic makes them great for rescuing your army around and increase everyone's mobility. It also makes them great healers, as they can often afford to put themselves in danger while restoring the unit's HP. Libra has C staves, letting you use physic and ward at base, and has surprisingly good physical bulk, while Anna has D staves. However, her higher speed makes her much more likely to double, and combined with her high luck and the lucky 7 skill she gets at level 5, she can have very good avoid. People tend to say that Sari is useless, and while she isn't great, she's good enough for a free unit. She's not an enemy phase machine, more of a player phase assassination tool, which can be used in some of the power logs, which can be quite player phase based. She's also useful at supposing some of the speedy Valkyries in Chapter 17 on player phase, as with a speed tonic and a +4 pair up, she'll double them. And while the Khans come so late into the game that they rarely get talked about, the stats are still reasonable, allowing for them to survive a few rounds of combat against Lunatic Mode's strong late game double forged enemies. Basilio also has rally strength, which can help the player kill strong bosses like Grima, while Flavia's soul and higher speed can give her a better enemy phase. Although lots of people enjoy training their favourite characters from Zeros as heroes, which is especially true with child units, you may as well deploy these pre-promotes if you need the extra help, provided that they aren't an active liability, which is only really going to be the case in the last few maps of the game if you overextend them. The later game pre-promotes may not be as fantastic as the early mid-game squad, however you may as well attempt to find what use you can out of them, given that they are literally free. So, what have we learned today? While this mode is certainly harder than a lot of modes that you'll be used to, it is still very possible. You have Frederick, who, while not invincible, can usually damage enemy formations while everyone else can run in and finish enemies off. And, if you play with purpose and think about what each move you are doing achieves, the early game maps will be less hard to complete. Pair up is not something that you should do without thinking, and instead you should carefully consider not only when it is the right time to pair up, but which units might get the most out of a pair up. It's also important to remember to use those dual support bonuses to maximize your hit, avoid, crit, and crit avoid. And finally, make sure to use everything that you have available and pull out all the stops. If the game gives you something for free or very cheap, the more value that you can stretch out of it, the better. I hope this helped any players who are looking into playing Lunatic mode either as a reattempt or on their first try. Obviously this video is a bit more of a broader look at the entire game rather than the specifics, so you still might struggle on a specific chapter. To remedy this, I'm going to link solutions up to Chapter 4 in the description. The strategies I use aren't perfect, nor are they the only way of doing things. However, if you're completely stuck on a specific map and just want to be done with it, you can follow these methods to skip it. If you've got any questions at all, leave them down below in the comments. That's all from me from now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.